Two men were sealed inside a pressurized chamber. They couldn't get out. They couldn't signal. At the control panel, their supervisor saw a gauge showing falling pressure, so he kept adding helium to stabilize it. The gauge was reading the wrong part of the system. The pressure where his divers were sealed was climbing with every injection, turning the chamber into an oven. The flaw that killed Holmes and Baldwin was documented. Nothing was done about it. This is what led to the Vaga Drill II disaster on the 9th of September, 1975. A diver held in saturation at 310 feet cannot return to the surface when a shift ends. The safe return from that depth took days, so saturation divers lived at working pressure for the full contract, rotating between the chamber and the seafloor through a diving bell. Two people for days at a time inside a sealed, pressurized vessel, dependent on a control panel they could not see and could not reach. The chambers themselves were the size of a small van. Two divers shared that space throughout their rotation, eating, sleeping, waiting. The helium in the atmosphere raised the pitch of every voice so high that normal conversation was almost impossible. Comfort was never part of the design. Survival was, and it depended on the person operating the control panel outside. In the early 1970s, the North Sea floor held something the world badly needed: oil. The only option was saturation divers. By the mid-1970s, the North Sea was the fastest expanding offshore oil region in the world. Rigs were being positioned and diving contracts issued faster than the regulations could keep pace. Commercial divers died on the job at an estimated 40 times the rate of any other worker. At 390 feet, compressed air becomes toxic. Nitrogen narcosis at that depth shuts a diver down. Oxygen toxicity triggers seizures. At depth, that is almost always fatal. Saturation divers breathe heliox instead, a mixture of helium and oxygen that has no narcotic effect. But helium carries a cost. It conducts heat roughly 5 to 6 times faster than air. In response, saturation chambers are maintained between 85 and 93 degrees Fahrenheit at working depth. The most dangerous feature of the Vaga Drill II's saturation system was built into the design. Chamber 1 had no dedicated depth gauge. Instead, every gauge on the panel could be switched to read any part of the system. The logic was simple. If one gauge failed, another could cover for it. The entrance lock did have its own depth gauge, but testimony at the inquiry revealed it had been deliberately turned off because it gave readings that conflicted with the others. The one independent check in the system had been removed. The most accurate gauge on the panel was called a hyza. The supervisor trusted it more than any other instrument, so during every transfer, he used the hyza alone to track the bell's depth. He avoided switching between gauges that might give slightly different readings. It had worked before, but it required one step. Once the divers were safely inside Chamber 1, the supervisor had to reset the valves so the hyza would read their chamber. If that step was forgotten, Chamber 1 had no pressure monitoring at all. The supervisor would be reading a different part of the system entirely and have no way of knowing it. Nothing on the panel would tell him he was reading the wrong chamber. On the evening of September 9th, the dive went exactly as planned. The danger was waiting on the surface. The Vaga Drill II was positioned near the Bruce Field, 200 miles northeast of Aberdeen. Holmes and Baldwin had been assigned a routine task at 390 feet, clearing a rope tangle from equipment on the seafloor. The bell was brought back to the surface, and the crew began the transfer procedure. At 9:50 that evening, the crew connected the bell to the pressurized chambers on the rig. This was the final step. Holmes and Baldwin would climb out of the bell and into the chambers where they would live until it was safe to decompress. Then, a gas leak developed at the connection point. The bell was removed. The crew cleaned the seal and tried again. On the second attempt, it appeared to hold. Holmes and Baldwin moved through the entrance lock toward Chamber 1. Then, the reading shifted. The leak had returned. The crew tried to close the entrance lock door to seal the divers off from the leak. It didn't work. The supervisor ordered Holmes and Baldwin directly into Chamber 1. The men leaned against the hatch while the supervisor injected a small quantity of helium to seal it behind them. At that moment, he forgot to reset the valves. and the valve handles on the console that would have shown the error went unchecked. The HYSA gauge was still reading the entrance lock, still registering the falling pressure from the ongoing leak. The supervisor believed he was reading chamber 1. He concluded the hatch seal had failed and that pressure was escaping, so he began injecting large quantities of helium to reseal a door that was already sealed. The gauge readings kept falling. He kept pumping in helium. The man reported the heat. The supervisor took it as confirmation, more proof of the pressure loss he was fighting. By the time the crew realized what had happened, the pressure inside chamber 1 had more than doubled. The two men were experiencing the equivalent of 650 feet of ocean pressing down on them. Holmes and Baldwin tried to open the hatch. The hatch opened inward, toward them. The pressure on their side was holding it shut. No amount of force from two men could move it. When the helium flooded into chamber 1, the air inside compressed. In that confined, humid space, the heat had nowhere to go. Within minutes, the temperature inside the chamber had climbed beyond what the human body can regulate. The body cools itself through sweat evaporating off the skin. In that humidity, it couldn't evaporate. The core body temperature rose past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the threshold where organs begin to shut down. They pulled the mattresses from their bunks and lay against the aluminium floor. Metal draws heat from the body. Foam does not. The crew watched through the chamber portholes. There was nothing they could do. On record, it was the first case of hyperthermia, fatal overheating in North Sea saturation diving. Holmes and Baldwin died several hours later. At 1 a.m, another diver was readied and sent into the system. 15 minutes later, he reached chamber 1. He found Holmes and Baldwin where the crew already knew they would be. He checked for pulses. He attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on two men whose bodies had begun to stiffen. When it was over, he could not leave. Saturation divers cannot surface on demand. Decompression takes days. A medical officer was flown in from Aberdeen just after 2 a.m. That evening, the bodies of Peter Holmes, 29, and Roger Baldwin, 24, were lifted off the rig. The fatal accident inquiry opened in Aberdeen in March of 1977, 18 months after Holmes and Baldwin died. Medical witnesses testified they had never seen heat stroke kill a diver in a saturation dive. The judge concluded that the way Oceaneering designed the diving system made operator mistakes highly likely, especially during an emergency. Then, Oceaneering's own safety officer took the stand. He testified under oath that the control panel's layout was a contributing cause of the deaths. The judge ordered fixed pressure gauges on every saturation chamber. One detail went unnoticed. Hours after Holmes and Baldwin died, a diving inspector from the Department of Energy was flown to the Vaga Drill II. He looked through the chamber porthole and saw two men crumpled on the floor. He reviewed the dive log and questioned the crew. Then he assessed the saturation system, decided it was safe to operate, and told Oceaneering the divers could continue. They did. Holmes and Baldwin were two of the 55 commercial divers who died in the North Sea before the end of the decade. In January 1974, a year before the Vaga Drill II, two divers were working from the drill master. One was inside the diving bell, the pressurized capsule that carries divers between the chamber and the seabed. The other was outside, tethered to the bell by his umbilical. The bell was held at depth by a heavy drop weight. When the weight released by accident, the bell shot to the surface from 320 feet, with its bottom door open. The crew found one diver dead inside. The other, dragged through the water on his line, was never recovered. In November 1978, 3 years later, two divers were inside a bell beside the Barrel Alpha platform. The bell was connected to the Star Canopus, a ship holding position above them using thrusters. A 40-knot wind overwhelmed the thrusters. The ship was blown across a nearby anchor chain that cut every line to the bell. The bell dropped to the seabed. To surface in an emergency, divers released the bell's drop weight, but the weight was pinned from the outside and the bottom hatch was pressed against the seabed. They couldn't reach it. With no strobe or transponder, rescue teams had no way to find the bell. 13 hours on the North Sea seabed, breathing heliox that stripped heat from their bodies. One froze to death, the other drowned. The first UK diving safety regulations were passed in 1981, 6 years after Holmes and Baldwin died. 2 years later, 5 men died aboard the Byford Dolphin in a fraction of a second. A clamp was opened while the chamber system was still pressurized at 9 atmospheres. One diver was forced through a gap in the chamber door measuring roughly 24 inches. His organs were expelled onto the deck. Part of his spine was found 30 feet above the chamber. That investigation is on screen now. Subscribe to discover more below the blue. See you in the deep.